All right, today we're jumping into one of the most incredible acts of protest in all of history, the Salt March. We're going to see how a simple, everyday mineral became the symbol of a nation's fight for freedom against, well, the biggest empire on the planet.
It sounds a little crazy, right? How on earth could a pinch of salt actually threaten the mighty British Empire? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. The answer's all about a brilliant strategy that took a common problem and turned it into this massive, unifying cry for independence. So let's start at the very beginning.
First things first, we've got to understand the situation on the ground. The whole reason this protest even worked is because it was aimed at a single, deeply unfair law. A law about something every single person needed to live.
Okay, so get this. The government had total, and I mean total control over who could make salt and who could sell it. This wasn't some minor rule. It was a full-on state monopoly. And that meant they could tax it. So every single person in India, whether you were rich or poor, had to pay the government just to get something their bodies literally need to survive.
And this is where Mahatma Gandhi's genius comes in. Look at the word he used. He didn't just call the tax unfair or unjust, he called it sinful. That was an absolute masterstroke. By framing it that way, he lifted the protest from just a political argument to a moral crusade. He connected this huge idea of freedom to a daily hardship that every Indian felt in their own homes.
So, with the moral high ground totally secured, the stage was set for this incredibly dramatic act of defiance that was about to grab the world's attention. This was the March to Dundee.
Just let that number sink in for a second. 240 miles. On foot. This wasn't just a protest for an afternoon. This was an epic trek, a huge commitment of time, of energy, and of pure spirit, and it was all designed to look the empire right in the eye and challenge it. And the plan itself? It was just beautiful in its simplicity. Step 1, Gandhi and his followers would start marching from his ashram. Step 2, they'd walk all the way to the coastal town of Dundee. And then, step 3, the grand finale, they would do one simple, illegal thing. Make their own salt, straight from the sea.
And so, after 24 long days of walking, on April 6, 1930, Gandhi finally reached the ocean. He bent down and he picked up a lump of natural salt. And with that one tiny gesture, he broke British law. It was such a quiet act, but its message came through loud and clear. We will not obey.
But here's the thing, and this is so important, this was never just about one man. The real power of the Salt March was how it lit a fire across the country, inspiring an entire nation to join in and turning a single protest into a massive, unstoppable movement.
And I mean, everyone got involved. You had peasants and tribal communities, people who were hit hard by all sorts of colonial laws. You had business federations who saw the economic injustice. And crucially, you had women who joined the fight in huge, huge numbers and completely transformed the movement.
Now, here's a really fascinating little detail that shows you how the movement was growing and changing in real time. At the very beginning, Gandhi himself was actually hesitant about having women join the march. He had his reasons, for sure, but he was about to be convinced by a very powerful voice. And that voice belonged to Sarojini Naidu. She was a major political leader in her own right, and she basically argued for and won the right for women to participate. And her involvement wasn't just for show. She was a major leader of the march, proving just how essential women were to shaping the entire freedom struggle.
You know, the impact this had on the women who joined was just profound. Listen to this story about Ambambai of Karnataka. She was arrested, she served time, she got out and she got arrested all over again. But she didn't see it as a sacrifice. She called those the happiest days of her life, because the struggle gave her life a whole new meaning and purpose.
So as this movement got bigger and bigger, the British government obviously couldn't just stand by and watch its authority get challenged like this. Their response was, well, pretty predictable, and it was brutal.
Thousands. That's how many people were arrested and thrown in jail. The government's reaction was just massive. They were trying to stamp out this defiance with sheer force.
And it wasn't just arrests. The authorities used brutal force against the satyagrahis, the peaceful protesters. For the empire, this was standard procedure. Crush any dissent, show your strength, and stay in control. But this time, the whole world was watching. And the images of this violent crackdown on nonviolent people did so much damage to Britain's reputation.
The cost was just incredibly high. This quote tells the story of
Veer Lakhan Nayak, a tribal leader who was eventually executed for his role. And his only regret? That he wouldn't live to see a free India. It's just a heartbreaking reminder of the ultimate sacrifice that so many people made.
So, what did all this struggle and sacrifice actually achieve? Well, the Salt March became a global news story. Reports and photos of police beating peaceful protesters created enormous international pressure on the British, forcing them to do more than just crack down.
You can literally draw a straight line from this moment. The march happens in 1930, putting the empire on the defensive. Then, by 1935, that pressure leads directly to the Government of India Act, a huge package of reforms. And by 1937, that act leads to the first major elections.
And this led to a really crucial idea: provincial autonomy. So what does that actually mean? Well, for the first time, Indian provinces could make a lot of their own decisions. It was a real, tangible shift of power away from the central British government, a shift that was won through protest.
And here's the proof in the pudding. After those elections, the Indian National Congress, the main party of the freedom movement, actually formed the government in a majority of the provinces. For the first time, Indians were governing Indians at a large scale. The March for Salt had directly led to a real taste of self-rule.
You know, the story of the Salt March leaves us with this really powerful question. It teaches us that sometimes the best way to fight a giant injustice is to focus on a small, universal one that everybody understands. It really makes you wonder, what symbol, as simple as a pinch of salt, could unite people for a cause today?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century, the final, chaotic years of British rule in India. It's a story of hope, of an incredible struggle for freedom, but also one of profound tragedy.
And that's the big question, right? How did this decades-long dream of a single, independent India get so tangled up with the painful, violent reality of its own division? That's what we're going to unpack.
So, let's set the scene. We're in the middle of World War II. Britain is stretched thin, fighting for its own survival. And back in India, nationalist leaders see this as the moment, the perfect time to launch one last massive push to finally end colonial rule. And at the heart of this push is this powerful, almost shocking call from Mahatma Gandhi, do or die. Now let's be really clear about this. This wasn't a call for violence. It was a declaration that the time for negotiation was over. This was it. The struggle, the non-violent struggle, had to be total. The goal was simple: make the British quit India. For good.
And boy, did the movement just explode. You know, Gandhi and the other top leaders were arrested almost immediately. But it didn't matter. The movement took on a life of its own. It pulled in everyone, peasants, students, who started attacking the symbols of British power, things like railway lines and post offices. In some places, people actually kicked the British out and set up their own governments. But as you can imagine, the British response was incredibly harsh. And when I say harsh, I mean on a massive scale. Just look at this number. By the end of 1943, more than 90,000 people were arrested. The British were determined to crush this thing. But even so, something had shifted. This final push had shaken the foundations of their empire in India.
But here's where it gets complicated. Even as so many people were united against the British, they weren't all united on how to achieve freedom. There were different ideas, different philosophies, bubbling up among the nationalists themselves.
So, you've basically got these two towering figures with two very different approaches. On one hand, you have Gandhi and his philosophy of ahimsa, nonviolence, fighting the battle from inside India. And on the other hand, you have Subhas Chandra Bose, who believed that freedom would only come through militant action. He actually escaped India to form the Indian National Army, the INA, hoping to literally fight his way in. But what's so fascinating is that despite these huge differences, Bose had deep respect for Gandhi and was actually the one who first called him the father of the nation. Now, as big as that fight against the British was, an even more complex conflict was brewing inside India itself. A deep political divide over the fundamental question of what an independent India should even look like. And right at the center of this divide was something called the two-nation theory. This was the idea, pushed hard by the Muslim League, that Hindus and Muslims weren't just different religious communities living in one country. No, they were two completely separate nations, and each, they argued, deserved its own country. This wasn't just some abstract political debate. This idea would literally reshape the map of the world.
And this theory gained ground really fast. It started with the 1937 elections, which made the Muslim League worry that in a democratic India, Muslims would always be outvoted. By 1940, that worry turned into a formal demand for their own independent states. Then, after the war, negotiations completely broke down because the League insisted it was the only group that could speak for India's Muslims. And the proof, for them, came in 1946. They won a massive victory in seats reserved for Muslims, which they saw as a clear mandate for a separate nation, what they were now calling Pakistan.
Okay, so with political tensions just skyrocketing, the British try one last time, one final desperate attempt to find a compromise that would avoid splitting the country. This was the point of no return. So, in 1946, a British cabinet mission comes to Delhi. They put a pretty complex plan on the table for a united India, but a very loose one with a lot of power given to Muslim-majority provinces. It was a compromise. But it was just too little, too late. Neither the Congress nor the Muslim League could agree on the details. And with the failure of this mission, the political path to a united India was basically gone. It created a power vacuum, and violence was about to rush in and fill it. Partition was no longer a possibility. It felt inevitable.
So after the talks collapsed, the Muslim League felt backed into a corner. To show their strength and pressure the British, they called for a day of mass protest. They called it Direct Action Day. And that decision would prove to be absolutely catastrophic.
Because on that day, what was meant to be a political protest spiraled into horrific sectarian violence. Riots just ripped through Calcutta for days, and the human cost was sickening. We're talking thousands of people killed. The political disagreement had spilled onto the streets, and it was bloody.
From this moment on, it feels like the violence just takes over. It completely overshadows the politics, leading to one of the largest and most tragic migrations in all of human history.
Yeah, the riots in Calcutta, sadly, were just the beginning. By early 1947, that violence had spread like a wildfire all across northern India. Communities that had been neighbors for centuries were suddenly torn apart by fear, suspicion, and pure hatred.
It's a number that's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. While no one knows the exact figure, historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, children, were killed in the brutal violence of partition.
And beyond the sheer horror of the killings was the displacement. Millions of people forced to abandon their homes, their land, everything they had ever known. Hindus and Sikhs desperately trying to get to India, Muslims desperately trying to get to the newly formed Pakistan, they became refugees overnight.
And this was the end result of all that political failure and all that human suffering. The map was literally redrawn. On August 14, 1947, the new nation of Pakistan was born. India would gain its own independence just one day later.
I think this quote just captures it perfectly. For millions of people, this long-awaited moment of freedom wasn't pure joy. How could it be? It was forever mixed with the bitter, painful memories of violence, of loss, and of a country torn in two.
And that's really the question that lingers, isn't it? It's a legacy that both India and Pakistan are still dealing with today. The lines drawn on that map in 1947 left wounds so deep, they've shaped the history, the politics, and the very identity of an entire subcontinent.
Welcome. We're about to dive into one of the most significant, most complex events of the 20th century, the birth of modern India. But here's the thing. If you're looking for a simple story with a single hero, you've come to the wrong place.
So let's just start with that huge question. Who actually built modern India? You know how we tend to think of history as the story of a few legendary figures? Well, the reality is always so much more complicated and honestly, way more interesting.
Because the truth is, it wasn't one person. The foundation of modern India was laid by a whole team of leaders. Think of them as an ensemble cast, brilliant, passionate people who were sometimes the closest of allies and at other times the fiercest of rivals. Each one had a powerful and often conflicting vision for the future.
Okay, so to really get this, let's start with the core leadership inside the Indian National Congress. These were the people on the ground, the ones who weren't just dreaming of freedom, but were also grappling with the immense task of actually governing a brand new nation.
And first up, you have to talk about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. People called him the Iron Man of India, and for good reason. He was an absolute master of organization, the guy who handled the crucial nuts and bolts of the entire freedom movement.
And his journey is just incredible. I mean, he came from a humble farming family in Gujarat and became the movement's chief organizer way back in 1918. He built the grassroots network that gave the Congress its real power. And when it came down to those final, incredibly tense negotiations for independence, his pragmatism was absolutely essential.
Next up, we've got Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, who everyone knew as Rajaji. He was a veteran nationalist from the South, a real intellectual giant, known for his razor-sharp mind and incredible moral courage.
And look at this trajectory, it's amazing. He goes from leading major acts of civil disobedience, like the Salt Satyagraha in the South, to being a key player in the government in waiting, and then, in a truly historic move, he becomes the very first Indian Governor-General of a free India. Just think about that for a second.
And of course there's Jawaharlal Nehru, a close follower of Mahatma Gandhi. Nehru was the visionary of the group. He was the internationalist, the one who was really thinking about what India's identity would be on the world stage.
So this is what's so critical to understand about Nehru. His focus wasn't just on winning independence. No, he was thinking way beyond that. He was trying to craft the very framework of the new nation. Its economy, which was inspired by socialist ideas, its secular government, and its unique place in a world that was being torn apart by the Cold War.
But here's where the story gets really complicated. Because while these leaders were all fighting for independence, they were deeply, deeply divided on what the new nation should even look like. And that brings us to the champions of a united India and the fierce, heartbreaking debate over partition.
One of the most powerful voices for unity came from Maulana Azad. He wasn't just a political leader, he was also a profoundly respected Islamic scholar.
I mean, just look at his background. He was born in Mecca, was fluent in multiple languages, and brought this deep scholarly perspective to the whole movement. For him, being a devout Muslim and a passionate Indian nationalist weren't two separate things. They were one and the same.
This idea, this concept of Wahadat-e-Din, was at the very core of his philosophy. He believed in the essential oneness of all religions. And because of that, he was a relentless champion for Hindu-Muslim unity and one of the most formidable intellectual opponents of the two-nation theory.
And there's another powerful champion for united India, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. You might know him better as Badshah Khan or even the Frontier Gandhi.
So this guy was a Pashtun leader from the rugged northwest frontier province, and he founded this movement called the Khodai Khidmatgars, or Servants of God. What's incredible is that it was a powerful, totally non-violent movement among the Pashtuns, a community often stereotyped as being purely martial. His commitment to non-violence was unshakable.
And this part is just tragic. Badshah Khan was completely, fiercely opposed to the idea of partitioning India. So when the division was finally agreed upon, he felt utterly betrayed. He even famously called out his own Congress colleagues for what he saw as a devastating failure. That intense opposition from figures like Azad and Badshah Khan brings us directly to the man who would become the most powerful and ultimately the most successful voice for the other side of this argument. And that man was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. But what's so fascinating about Jinnah is that his political story isn't a straight line at all. It's actually a story of a huge, profound transformation.
Just look at how this maps out his ideological journey. For years, up until 1920, Jinnah was actually known as an ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. But then, after 1934, something shifts. He starts to reorganize the Muslim League, and by the 1940s, he has become the single most powerful and unwavering voice demanding a separate nation, Pakistan.
So, how do we make sense of all this? How did you have these brilliant people with such powerful and conflicting visions all existing within the same movement for independence?
Well, it all comes back to this idea. They were allies in the fight to end colonial rule, no doubt, but they were absolute rivals in the debate over the future. And in the end, through their arguments, their alliances, and their heartbreaking compromises, they all became the architects of the subcontinent's destiny.
And that really leaves us with one final, haunting thought to chew on. When leaders, all working towards what they believe is right, fundamentally disagree on the very idea of what a nation should be, what is the real cost of compromise? And who is it in the end that pays the price?